guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a book review for Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. This is a nonfiction account of the 1996 climbing year of Mount Everest. This was one of the deadliest years in Mount Everest history. I think the deadliest year up to 1996. I don't know about anything since then, but at the time, this was one of the worst years they'd ever had since people started climbing the mountain to the top. Jon Krakauer actually was there and actually did climb Mount Everest. This is kind of his take and his perspective on what happened, as well as him doing a bunch of research so he could get all the point of views that weren't his. I buddy read this with Cozy Reader Kelly, who I will link down below, and I gave this book 4 stars. Kelly gave it 5 stars, and I think we had very similar thoughts on it. I think she just enjoyed it a little bit more than I did, and potentially I'm also just really stingy with my 5-star ratings. This was wonderful. I really have no interest in mountain climbing, rock climbing, Mount Everest in general. It's just not something I'm particularly drawn to. I kind of have the perspective that things like that are just unnecessarily dangerous and kind of silly, but other people enjoy them, so good on them. But I really did love this book. I thought this was wonderful. I was kind of hoping it would be good because this was my first Jon Krakauer book of the year, only my second of all time, and I wasn't quite in love with his writing style yet. I just didn't really know that much about it. But this book was absolutely fantastic. I think if you're not interested in Mount Everest or mountain climbing or anything like that, there's still a lot for you in this book. But if you are, in particular, interested in that kind of thing, I can't recommend this enough. To start off with, this was a surprisingly emotional book. I expected this to be more procedural, just like Jon Krakauer recounting all the events and all the people and all the facts of what happened, and he does do that to a degree. He's very good at doing that. But he also humanizes everyone. It's not just that we learn facts about people, that they exist as real life people. He turns them into real people that we can relate to. He's so good at capturing their personalities. It would have been very easy for this book to fall into the trap of just coming across like a dry history textbook, just like recounting literally the events and the play-by-play, but it was so much more than that. The story was crafted so well that it wasn't just sad that people died. Jon Krakauer made it utterly heartbreaking, and I love him for that. And because of that, it was so scary and stressful to read. Like, you know from the beginning that people die. You actually know who's going to die because he talks about them in the acknowledgments of this book, and I think potentially in the prologue as well. There was just a list of all the people who died that he essentially wrote this book for. So there's not really an element of surprise there, but it still felt so suspenseful. Like, just reading this, I just wanted to cringe and say, please stop, because there were so many points where it just would have been easy for them to be like, okay, let's turn back. The conditions are bad. This is bad. This person is not feeling well. We should just go back. There were a dozen different things that could have easily just been changed, and so many people would have lived. I think this was especially true for Doug Hansen, who was a member of Krakauer's party specifically. He was a major player in the books, I think because Krakauer knew him, I don't want to say fairly well, but of all the people who died, Krakauer seemed closest with Doug Hansen. And there were just so many points where you thought he was going to turn back, where it just seemed likely that he would have turned back, that anyone would have in that situation. But he didn't, and you know he's going to die from the very beginning. But it was heartbreaking when it did finally happen. And I think that's a testament to how well Krakauer crafted this story, because it was so suspenseful and heartbreaking, even though it is obviously a nonfiction book. I also learned a lot about Everest in this book, which I really enjoyed. There's obviously still a lot that I don't know and don't understand, and I definitely didn't grasp everything just because I am such a beginner at this. I have no knowledge, so Krakauer would talk about things in depth, and I'd just get kind of the big picture of it. But one thing I really didn't know was how much people are impaired by the lack of oxygen. Like, I knew the lack of oxygen was a problem. I just don't think I realized how much. I kind of thought that, oh, like, they carry their own oxygen, they take it with them, so they're fine. But that's not really true at all. Like, they're still very mentally impaired, even though they do carry oxygen. Krakauer said that he mistook a stranger for one of his friends. And he didn't realize for months. Like, they'd written up the account and Krakauer had been like, yeah, like, I saw my friend here and he said this to me and then walked away. And it wasn't until months later when he was researching this book that he realized he never actually did see his friend. That was just some random stranger. And it was one of those things where I was like, wow, like I had no idea it was like that. There was also a lot of discussions on like safety regulations on Everest, and my entire discussion on this in this review is going to be from a standpoint of 1997 when this book was published. I have no idea what has changed in the last 22 years. I'm sure there have been changes. I am entirely unaware of them, so if you do know any of that, just keep in mind that this is a dated discussion. As of 1997, the only regulation was that you needed to have a permit. Once you got a permit to climb Everest, it really didn't matter what your skill level was. It didn't matter what your equipment was. There were no regulations on the guides. You didn't have to be of a specific caliber to be a guide. You could just do whatever you wanted as long as you got that permit for the right number of people. And that was just kind of shocking to me for something that's as dangerous as Everest is, that's killed so many people. You'd think there'd be like a few more regulations, like, hey, you have to like have this kind of equipment, and you have to like be this level skilled in order to become a guide and literally take people up the mountain. But there really wasn't anything. It was just kind of a free for all once you got a permit. And that was kind of disturbing to me, especially when Krakauer was talking about some of the other people in the mountain and the lack of experience they had, and how he was like, I'm basically as experienced as some of these people, and I'm much more experienced than these other people. And it was just so strange to me that they're allowed to go up the mountain even though they literally don't have the skills or the right equipment, and there's a very good chance that they're going to hurt either themselves or somebody else through their ignorance. And he talked about the guides and how the guides' business kind of relies upon getting people to the top of Mount Everest. And if they don't get people to the top of Mount Everest, their business goes down. So they're kind of focused on that above all else. Like, safety is a concern, yes, but it seemed almost less important than their business and getting people to the top. Because if you start failing to get people to the top, they're not going to sign up with you as a guide. They're going to pick someone who has a higher success rate. And that was just so concerning, that like these guides were putting people in danger because of the conditions and because they just really wanted that extra business and they didn't want to fail. And some of the other guides seemed more interested in their own ascent of Mount Everest than they did in the clients. Like, they were tasked with taking these very inexperienced people up the mountain, and they would just be more concerned with what they were doing and getting themselves up to the top and kind of just like leave the clients behind. And that was scary. Krakauer said at one point that he thought one thing that should be required is no oxygen, which was like at first kind of shocking to me. I was like, wouldn't more people die if like you didn't allow them to carry oxygen? But then he explains his position and says, look, if we ban people from taking oxygen up the mountain, then people who are not skilled literally cannot get up the mountain. And you would only have the most skilled people going up and climbing it. And I was like, that actually makes really good sense. Like, I have no opinion on this. I don't know anything. But it was something that I never thought of before, and was one of those kind of like almost counterintuitive things that might actually work. But I don't know, that was just a really interesting point that I wanted to bring up. One thing that did bother me a bit in this book, but mostly just in climbing culture in general, was the way Sherpas are treated. Sherpas are the people who live on the mountain, not like high up on Mount Everest, but live like kind of near the base of Mount Everest. And their job is to help people who come in, the tourists, climb the mountain. They're frequently hired on to carry supplies and set up camps so that it's easier for the tourists to climb up the mountain. But they get no credit, they get none of the fame, they get nothing except, you know, a little bit of money, and they don't get paid very much, when it seems like in general they're doing most of the work. Like, these white people come in and climb the mountain, and they hire Sherpas to carry their belongings, they hire Sherpas to set up their camps, and then the white people get to write books about how they climbed Mount Everest, and they're like, oh yeah, the Sherpas helped so much, but that's kind of all they get. And that bothered me. Krakauer did point it out several times, but I don't think he really pointed it out enough so that it didn't bother me. I felt like that was something that needed to be discussed more in depth. I don't know how much the culture has changed in the last 20 years, but I'm guessing not that much. The only other critique that I kind of had of this book was the epilogue and the prologue. He talks a bit in the prologue about how he wrote this book for him. He wrote this book so that he could kind of make sense of what happened and figure out the series of events and how everything went wrong. And he wrote this for himself so that it might not be a book that other people would appreciate as much. But the irony was, That literally only bothered me in the prologue and the epilogue, especially the epilogue. In the epilogue, he talked about family members of the people who died and how they were like placing blame and he thought some of it was unfair. And that very much rubbed me the wrong way. I didn't like the way he talked about the family members of those who died. I didn't think that was necessary to this book at all. And honestly, just the prologue and epilogue in general didn't feel necessary. Those two sections felt like it was for him, but the rest of this book was so well done. Like, the first and last chapters felt entirely self serving, which is kind of what he discussed in them. But the rest of the book didn't. The rest of the book was incredibly reflective and insightful and well researched. And it just kind of was strange to me that that the only time I felt that he was being self-serving was when he was talking about how this book might be self-serving. And it didn't feel necessary and it kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I do also want to add that this book is rather dense, and I don't mean that as a bad thing. I love that it was dense, but I'm usually more of a binge reader when it comes to books. I like to pick up a book and sit down and read for hours, but Kelly and I read this 2 chapters at a time, and I was never itching to get ahead of that pace. It was just kind of like, this is comfortable. I don't think I could handle more than this. And I do think that's just something to know going in, that it's not a difficult read, but it is rather dense and a little bit slow. But all in all, this was absolutely wonderful, and I highly recommend if you're interested in a story like this, even if, like me, you're a beginner who knows nothing about Mount Everest, because it's well explained enough that you really will be able to follow along, and you shouldn't have any issues in that regard, because I know literally nothing, and I did it just fine. Let me know down below if you've read Into Thin Air and what you thought of it if you have, and as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.